Hello everyone, the Isle of Man International has just kicked off, and it's one of the strongest open tournaments this year. I have an interesting game to show you from the first round, played between Vishy Anand and Sadhwani Raunak, a 13-year-old international master from India. It's never easy playing against these young prodigies as they are constantly improving, and you never know when they are going to suddenly explode and go off. So in this game, Raunak with the white pieces, Anand has black. White opens with e4, Anand responds with e5, we have knight f3, knight c6 and bishop b5 to Roy Lopez. a6, bishop a4, and here Anand plays g6. So this line has been gaining some popularity lately. Anand also played this in the Batumi Chess Olympiad last month. So here white castles, bishop g7, c3 preparing to strike with d4, Anand goes b5, bishop b3, we have d6 and d4. So here Anand takes on d4, and c takes d4 here is a natural move. But here white didn't go for this because he was probably worried that these pawns in the center might become targets for black. So here he played knight takes d4, bishop d7 from Anand, we have bishop d5, so attacking this knight twice, and this knight cannot move because then this rook would fall. So knight g to e7 defending, bishop g5 pinning this knight, so Anand plays f6 breaking the pin, but this opens up this a2 g8 diagonal for white's bishop. And white has to be happy with the way the opening went. Knight takes c6 from white, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, knight takes c6, and bishop h4. Anand plays queen to d7. So here castling immediately is impossible because queen d5 check wins the knight. So queen d7 first, protecting this knight on c6. And white goes a4, taking advantage of this undefended rook on a8. So here again castling, white can go a takes b5, then give a check, and at the end of the variation he wins the pawn on b5. So that is why here Anand plays rook to b8. Raunak plays a takes b5, and then rook to a6, again trying to stop black from castling, making life a bit difficult for Anand, because again castling then queen to d5 wins the knight. So here Anand goes knight e7, queen b3 again stops black from castling because the queen now controls this diagonal, and queen g4 from Anand. So going for a very brave plan, trying to win this pawn on e4. So here knight c8 seems to be safer. So the plan is to bring the queen to f7, trying to trade queens. So here for example knight a3, queen f7, and if white doesn't trade queens, then black will get in castling. So here after queen g4 from Anand, we have bishop g3, queen takes e4, so a very brave move from Anand, just taking that pawn with his king still stuck in the center. Rook a7 from Raunak, a good move. Looking at c7, so here the best move is probably queen c4 from Anand. So here white can take on c7, recovering the pawn, and after knight f5, well, black is surviving, but white is definitely better here. With this knight is a little bit overloaded. There might be some tactics on g7 and d6, but for the moment black is okay because he has some pressure on b2 as well. So here after rook a7, Anand plays king to d7, just holding on to that pawn. And things are actually quite dangerous here. And now rook to d1, simply threatening to take on d6. So Anand defends that with rook to b6. And here the next step for white is to bring this knight on b1 into the game. So knight d2 probably slightly better than knight to a3. because this comes with a tempo on the queen. So one of the possible lines, for example, queen d5, then here's c4. And white has a very strong initiative. This cannot be taken because then queen takes b6. This pawn is pinned. So here, for example, if queen e6, then after c5, white has a great position. If queen takes b3, knight takes b3, this rook is attacked. So if rook c6, then you can play bishop takes d6, taking advantage of this pinned pawn on c7. So here knight d2, probably slightly better, but knight a3 from Raunak. Also very logical and direct, going after b5. So Anand plays knight c8, attacking this rook. f3 from Raunak. And here queen to e8. Well, instead of queen to e7, queen to e8 gives black the option of playing queen to g8, challenging white's queen. So here rook to a5 from Raunak, putting more pressure on this pawn. But rook to a8 is probably more annoying for black because of this pin on the knight. But okay, we have rook to a5, queen e6 from Anand, trying to trade queens, but Raunak plays queen b4, avoiding that because black's king is a bit weak now. So queen b4 keeps the initiative for white. Bishop h6 from Anand, activating this bishop. And also now white has to be a bit careful of some bishop to e3 moves. And here Raunak goes rook takes b5. So knight takes b5 is probably better, bringing the knight to a more active square, pressuring c7 and d6, and also keeping options for rook to a7. Also, white is currently threatening queen a4 with some nasty discoveries, so black has to play very accurately to survive this position. And the knight, for the moment, it cannot be chased away with something like c6, because then rook a7. So if this is taken, then rook takes d6 check and white wins. And if king d8, then knight takes d6, and the knight is threatening to give discoveries on f7. And if rook takes b4, then black gets mated. So knight b5 probably better, but white goes rook takes b5. Anand plays rook to e8. But this is a bit slow because now white has knight to c4. And white is starting to get an initiative. Here the best move would probably be queen to e2 instead of rook e8. So with this move, black can trade off a pair of rooks. So this comes with an attack on the rook on d1. And after rook e1, then you can play rook takes b5. And here after bishop e3, king h1, queen to d3, black is starting to consolidate. If he can get in knight b6 and rook to e8, then black should be doing fine. But anyway, here rook e8, and Raunak goes knight c4. Rook to a6. And this is an inaccuracy from Anand. It was better to take the rook, because after rook to a6, now white has ideas of rook b to d5, pressuring this point on d6 and also threatening queen b5 check with an attack on this rook. So the best move here is to play h3 first, giving the king a flight square on h2, because if you play rook b d5 immediately, then black goes bishop e3 check. So white has to take the bishop. This is still good for white, but he would lose one of his good attacking pieces. So here it is worth noting that you cannot go king h1 because then queen takes d5, black wins material. You cannot take the queen because rook a1 and white will soon get mated. So oops, let's go back. Rook a6 after h3. This is one of the possible continuations. Bishop e3 check, king h2, h5, then you go rook b to d5. So now white is threatening to play queen b5 check. The computer thinks that h4 is the best move here. Let's see what happens if you try to avoid queen b5 check. For example, if rook to a7, then now this pawn on d6 is no longer protected by the rook. And white can go bishop takes d6, followed by rook takes d6 check. And here white is winning. So here instead of rook to a7, let's say you try rook to c6. Then simply queen to a4 from white. Threatening knight to a5. And this there's nothing that black can do about this. So here let's go back to the main line. h3. After rook b to d5, h4 was suggested by the computer. But here after queen b5 check, then you simply pick up this rook. So here again, rook c6 would put the rook in a very awkward position, with knight to a5 coming, if possible, from white. And here c6 would be a very bad idea. Now this pawn is undefended. Also, the 7th rank is open up for white. He can go queen b7, then here rook takes d6, and this is devastating. Alright, so let's go back to the main game. After rook to a6, instead of that idea we discussed earlier, white plays rook to b8. Bishop e3 check from Anand, king h1, rook to c6. So here knight to a5 from Raunak, and Anand plays rook to b6. So this allows Anand to exchange off a pair of rooks. And now c4 from Raunak, threatening to play c5. So therefore Anand plays king to e7, stepping out of the d file. c5 from Raunak. So I'm not quite sure what the idea is behind c5, because simply bishop takes c5. So here rook to e1 instead of c5 seems to make more sense, just spinning this bishop. But anyway, c5, bishop takes c5, and here queen to h4, threatening this pawn. So queen f7 defends h7, also steps out of any rook to e1 pins. Queen to h6. So here, instead of queen to h6, knight b7 was a more challenging try. Because after queen to h6, then now g5 from Anand. So Anand wants to trade queens. g5 makes room for the queen to come to g6. f4 from white. We have queen to g6. Now the queens are traded off. So this pawn on h3 is now a bit weak, so Anand attacks it immediately with bishop to e3. We have bishop h4 and king f7. So stepping out of any rook to e1 pins and now preparing to simply take the pawn on h6. So rook to f1, attacking this f6 pawn. We have knight d7, knight to c6, and now Anand takes the pawn. Bishop takes h6. Raunak plays bishop e1 and knight to e5 from Anand. So trying to trade off this knight on c6. And if knight takes, this makes things easier for black. So now black has a very nice passed pawn on e5. So here after knight to e5, white goes knight d4, avoiding the trade. Knight to d3, attacking this pawn on b2, so that is defended. Bishop e3, knight to c2, and bishop f2. A nice move by Anand, so now white will find it difficult to contest black's rook on the e file. Rook to d1, knight to c5, knight b4, and knight to e4 with some ideas of knight to f2 after pulling the bishop back. So knight d3 defending the important f2 square, and bishop b6. And notice how this bishop on b6 stops white's king from participating in the endgame. Bishop e1. We have knight to g5, perhaps making room for this rook to come down to the second rank. And h4 from Raunak. So knight to e4, g3, and somehow Anand has managed to provoke white to have these pawns on the same color as this bishop. And we will see how Anand takes advantage of this later on. So Anand goes f5, making room for this knight to come to f6, but also, very importantly, controlling this square, preventing white from going g4. King g2, knight f6, knight to f4, and rook to e3. So maybe looking at this pawn. Bishop c3. So now white threatens bishop takes f6, followed by knight e5, which would fork the king and the rook. So Anand plays knight e4. Now looking at this pawn, we have rook to d3, c6, so Anand gets his pawns rolling. Rook takes e3, bishop takes e3, knight to d3, king to e6, so king activity is crucial in the endgame. Here, king f3, bishop f6, bishop h6, sorry, dropping the bishop back. Bishop to e1, protecting the pawn on g3, knight f6, b3, and knight g4. So Anand wants to further simplify things with knight to e5. So white avoids that with king to e2, knight to e5, knight to f2, d5, knight d3. It's almost as though white is throwing in the towel, allowing Anand to trade off this knight. So here's c5. This is already lost for white. King e2, bishop f8. So now Anand brings the bishop to h5 first. He locks down, prevents white from going g4, and then now he brings the bishop to d6. So notice how this bishop on e1 is tied down to the defense of g3. Bishop f2 from Raunak. Bishop e5, king d3, and now king d6. Vishy tries to activate this king, bringing the king over to the queen side. Bishop e1, king c6, bishop f2, king b5. Well, there's not much that white can do here. He just goes back and forth with his bishop. But here's c4 check from Anand. King c2, and here king c5. And it was in this position that Sadhwani Raunak resigned the game. Anand is simply going to march his king over to the king side and mop up these pawns. And there's nothing that white can do about it because he has to keep watch over this pass c pawn. So I hope you enjoyed the game. Feel free to subscribe for more future content and also updates and game coverage on the Isle of Man International Tournament. Until then, see you in the next video.